Hey there all you gals, gents, and peeps. If you're a member of the LGBTQ community most of the time, almost every time, 99.9% of the time, you're able to come to the rational conclusion that conservatives and the Republican Party hate your guts and want you dead. So, when they make surface-level platitudes and false promises, it's easy to see through the lies. But what about when someone in the political center makes platitudes and promises? You know, the people that believe that moderation is the answer to all political woes? What if they say that you're going too far, that if you just tone things down, tomorrow will be better? I mean, sounds good, right? Plausible even at times. Is there any harm in listening? And if there is, what do we do about it? And why are so many based orcs in the thumbnail? Well, all you gals, gents, and peeps, this is Axolotl Aristotle, here to explain it. If you've seen my Warhammer audio comic, you might have guessed I'm a fan of the series. One of Black Library's newer authors, Nate Crowley, is quickly becoming one of my favorites, right up there with Peter Fihirvari and Dan Abnett. One of his books, Gaz-Gothraka, Prophet of the Wa, published in paperback last March, has a scene that perfectly encapsulates why centrists aren't allies. Working with people much more talented than I am, we've done our best to bring that scene to life.
In the end, and with some irony, they had agreed to disagree. But before the prisoner's account could continue, the Death Watch veteran had found one more bone to pick.
Gazkill is a he
grumbled, wagging a finger at Biter, and receiving an uncertain grunt in reply.
You keep saying they.
Hendrickson clarified.
But Gazkill is a he. But they. He's not a man,
said Biter. Their brow ridge creased in bafflement. Folks, cut in then, before another messy debate could ensue. We've been through this, Orm. Orcs have no reproductive anatomy, and consequently no understanding of sex or gender.
Some of us understand sex or gender,
interrupted Biter, keen as ever to demonstrate their unusual expertise in humans.
I find it all quite funny.
Silence, Orc! Folks snapped, impatient to get back on track. From now on, Gazkul is a he, whether it makes sense or not.
As you wish,
the interpreter said, casually inspecting the rust-eaten buckles on the sleeve of their great coat. Then turning to address the Gretchen in their own tongue.
Smack snot runt. Mif bak log a bush git. Gazgul or nar. Boys.
At that, the Gretchen broke out into frantic snivelling yelps, which Folks would have taken for the onset of some sort of mental collapse if she hadn't known it was laughter, and which prompted a snort of amusement from Biter. But the interpreter knew they had pushed their luck with the aside, and after one look at Folks's face, urged the small creature on in a language they could all understand. A vicious blow to the temple.
Yes, I know it's not a direct one-to-one considering Folks is a key part of the fascist regime and Biter is another species, but I humbly ask you to suspend that disbelief. In this scenario, it's clear that Biter represents trans individuals being confused and upset about having to misgender themselves and their fellow trans allies. Hendrickson is definitely a stand-in for conservative bigots that want to erase trans people. Although, I will give Crowley credit. It's later revealed in the book that Hendrickson actually has a reason to hold this view. The Astartes isn't just some one-dimensional stand-in of herder, look at the dumb right-wing extremist. Isn't he so silly? His chapter master was slain by the Orc war boss, and his own toxic masculinity actively prevents him from acknowledging that anyone that isn't a man could kill his leader. But toxic masculinity and the other terrible reasons why transphobes are the way they are is another video entirely, and does not excuse transphobia under any circumstances. Finally, Folks represents the centrist here, the so-called voice of reason and moderation. Well, let's analyze how she utilized that philosophy, shall we? But Before I do that, I should probably define what centrism is. To do this, I'd like to borrow a scene from one of my favorite video games, Disco Elysium, because honestly, this description just straight up slaps.
Kingdom of Conscience. The kingdom of conscience will be exactly as it is now. Moralists don't really have beliefs. Sometimes they stumble on one, like on a child's toy left on the carpet. The toy must be put away immediately, and the child reprimanded. Centrism isn't change, not even incremental change. It is control over yourself and the world. Exercise it. Look up at the sky, at the dark shapes of the coalition airships hanging there. Ask yourself, is there something sinister in moralism? And then answer, no. God is in his heaven. Everything is normal on earth.
Oh fuck, that's so good. Although called moralism in-game, it's a clear one-to-one with centrism. The key takeaway is that the philosophy of the centrist is one of selfishness. Whether it's accurate or not, the centrist believes that life is going well for them, and that's all that really matters. It's why they're against change of any kind, even incremental change. And yes, while there are some centrists that say they are for incremental change, that definition of incremental is so tiny that any change is imperceptible. Why are they like this? Because what happens if change rocks the boat, as it were? Change has the possibility to take away their so-called perfect life. And so, the centrist does everything in their power to prevent that change from happening, especially within themselves. For you see, there is a reason Disco Elysium calls this thought process the kingdom of conscience. Centrists aren't actually morally bankrupt like Nazis, fascists, and a lot of conservatives. They actually have a conscience that pains them when they see injustices like racism, xeno, homo, and transphobia, people dying to a lack of health insurance, etc. The reality of our unjust world is their greatest enemy, and so they go to extreme lengths to insulate themselves from this, no matter the method. As an aside, when making this video, I kinda realized that my rant sona combined with the underwater background was basically the color scheme of the trans flag, so that's pretty fucking cool. Anyways, going back to Crowley's example in 40K, at first, because Fawkes has a conscience, she tried to stop Hendrickson and explain yet again that trans people have a right to exist. Hendrickson, representing the bigots we all know and hate, was going to refuse anyways, especially when Biter pointed out the limiting and, quite frankly, silly confines that transphobes try to place humanity in. Since there would be no moderation between the two groups, Fawkes has one of two options. Either let the discrimination continue, or use her authority to make Hendrickson shut the fuck up. But there's a key issue that I intentionally didn't mention up until this point, but should be pretty obvious to a lot of you watching. Hendrickson is a space marine, and therefore in the social normative, whereas Biter is an orc, or, using modern terminology, a minority. They inherently have less power and authority than the majority group. It would take a lot of effort on Fawkes' part, as well as making ways to enforce change to make Hendrickson stop his discrimination. In the context of the novel, that was too much effort for Fawkes to deal with, especially when mixed with her impatience to get back on track of the interrogation. But in the context of our reality, it would risk disrupting the gravy train that the life of a centrist supposedly is. So her solution was simple. Side with the norm, the majority, and even allowing the use of violence against the minority to quell any misgivings. I think at this point the comparison between the way Fawkes acted and how events in our history have occurred support the fact that centrists will allow for violence against minorities. Although this is a video on why the LGBTQ community shouldn't trust centrists, I do want to bring up the way the South treated its black population post-Civil War because I think it painfully shows the extent to which centrists will allow others to suffer in order to maintain the status quo. That, if it could happen to one minority group, it can happen to another. And just to be clear, while people of color in the LGBTQ community both suffer discrimination, the levels and types vary, so it's impossible to say that both groups suffer evenly or even the same types of discrimination in certain cases. For the following section, I'm going to be quoting a lot from the book How Democracies Die by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, because I think it's especially important for 2022, the year that I made this video, to understand that voting restrictions are the first step to one-party rule and the abuse of political opponents and minorities. Hopefully this isn't too much of a bother to anyone, as I usually try to make the majority of my videos my own work and keep quotes to a minimum, but as I said, these are just really important. Levitsky and Ziblatt wrote that,
under the 1867 Reconstruction Act and the 15th Amendment, which prohibited suffrage limitations on account of race, African Americans suddenly constituted a majority of the voting population in.
And they go on to list many southern states before listing the others that they were the near majority in. The consequences of this were that Black Americans were voting, and that was absolutely terrifying to white people.
In the 1880 presidential election, estimated Black turnout was 65% or higher in North and South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. At one point, more than 40% of legislators in Louisiana's and South Carolina's lower houses were Black. If Democratic elections continued, political scientist V.O. Key observed, it would have been fatal to the status of Black Belt whites.
Democracy's just cool like that, but only when it works. See, the majority of the South was still in control of asshat racist white men, and unfortunately, they saw the trend and knew they had to do something or else they wouldn't have the power and status they so desperately craved. And so, those racist white politicians decided to undermine democracy and the 15th Amendment that allowed for people of color to vote. Instead of banning minorities, they just simply made neutral-sounding laws that happened to affect minorities the majority of the time. Things like poll taxes, literacy tests, etc. The result of this, as Levitsky and Ziblatt note, was that
these reform measures effectively killed democracy in the American South. Black turnout in the South fell from 61% in 1880 to just 2% in 1912, locking in white supremacy and single-party rule for nearly a century.
The centrists in the South and the centrists in the North let this happen. Although what the Southerners were doing was legal to the letter of the law, everyone knew it violated its spirit. And because of that complacency to keep the status quo, racism, Jim Crow, segregation, lynchings, sadistic torture by the Klan, and massacres like Tulsa, Oklahoma were allowed to run rampant. Even to this day, atrocities continue to happen. One doesn't have to look further than the murder of Ahmaud Arbery in 2020, a 25-year-old black man just out for a jog who was viciously hunted down and executed by angry white men whose only defense in the closing statement of court was that he had no socks to cover his dirty toenails. It's absolutely disgusting, and I think this quote by a famous man can explain exactly why I find centrists to not only be despicable, but also help to cause these atrocities.
He who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps to perpetrate it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it.
And that man is Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And while he wasn't the only organization during the Civil Rights Movement, or the only important protester and leader, he did become the face of the movement, especially after his assassination. Unfortunately, since this video is about the interaction between the LGBTQ community and centrists, I can't go into immense detail when it comes to the Civil Rights Movement. It's something so vast that it deserves its own video. Instead, I'll just broadly cover some aspects of it that I think are important to the topic at hand. The first important thing to bring up is that while yes, King was nonviolent in his protests, the extremely important aspect that many people either don't know about or choose to ignore was that King was very fond of utilizing civil disobedience. For those of you who don't know what that is, civil disobedience is the idea that the law or laws are unjust and the best way to protest them is by breaking them. Examples of this would be white and black protesters entering diners and sitting together in the whites-only section, or perhaps the most famous and well-known, Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat to a white person on a bus. Civil disobedience is a more effective form of protesting and is often the next level of measures taken when peaceful protests fall on deaf ears. These types of protests are harder to ignore. Instead of simply saying, hey, this law is unjust and it shouldn't exist, one or even a group of people suddenly go in your face and start breaking that law to prove their point. However, a caveat of civil disobedience is that you can be arrested. Regardless of the morality of the law involved, it's still the law, and police are legally allowed to arrest those who violate it. Both Parks and King were arrested for practicing civil disobedience. There's actually more I want to say when it comes to King and why his methods of protesting were so effective, but I want to take a moment to pivot to an LGBTQ protest, an event so pivotal it can, and at least to me, is considered the watershed movement for gay rights. And that, my friends, is Stonewall. I'm going to say something now, and for better or worse, I want you to take a moment and think of the connotations and feelings you have towards how I describe Stonewall. Stonewall was a riot. Have you taken that moment? Okay, good. Stonewall was a riot, and a riot usually involves violence. Violence is the final escalation when it comes to protesting. When the situation's so bad and all other avenues of action have been exhausted, violence is there, eager to allow release of the abuse, rage, and tension built up from years of torture. For those of you who don't know what Stonewall is, I'll give you a brief summary now. It occurred during the 1960s, an era in American history where it was illegal to be gay. If people found out, you could be arrested and jailed. Most certainly you would get fired from your job. Even if you weren't jailed, the social ostracization you would suffer from the community was enough to ruin people's lives. How are you socially ostracized? Well, police would inform the local newspapers, of course. A Vox article by Chad Painter eloquently sums up the process.
If arrested, a person's name, age, address, and a crime would be published as part of the police blotter in most local newspapers across the US. Such publication often had disastrous consequences for the person outed in print.
Even the somewhat safe havens of gay bars, often owned by shady sources, weren't all that safe. Police would routinely raid them, arresting and physically assaulting LGBTQ patrons. Stonewall Inn was just one of those gay bars. And let me paint you a picture of just the kind of bar the LGBTQ community was forced to propagate. The inn was owned by the mafia, and since it was illegally run, because of how illegal the clientele was, among other things, they didn't have to abide by any safety standards. A well-written PBS article describes just how safe going to a gay bar was, even if a raid didn't happen.
Bartenders did not have access to running water behind the bar, so often served drinks in dirty, used glasses. Many gay rights groups blamed the Stonewall for a 1969 outbreak of hepatitis among its patrons. In violation of city code, Stonewall also lacked a rear exit, leaving the narrow front door as the only escape in the event of a fire or emergency. The alcohol served at the bar, rumored to be stolen or bootlegged, was watered down and sold to patrons at top-shelf prices. Stonewall's owners also reportedly engaged in extortion. Employees singled out wealthy patrons who were not public about their sexuality and blackmailed them for large sums of money with the threat of being outed. The practice eventually became the most profitable aspect of the mafia's club management.
On the night of June 28, 1969, police made an unannounced raid on the Stonewall Inn. What made this raid so different, aside from being unannounced, was that it followed just a few days after another police raid on June 24th. Reportedly, what ended up setting things into motion was a lesbian crying out to the crowd of onlookers to do something. Soon, items were being thrown at police, some as tiny as coins, others with more weight like bottles and bricks. Eventually, the police barricaded themselves inside the bar they had just raided with a few of the workers and people they were arresting. After numerous attempts to breach the bar, the patrons now turned protesters attempted to set the building ablaze. Yeah, remember how the mafia didn't have a fire exit? Bet the workers trapped inside were really regretting that one. Eventually, more police and firefighters showed up and put the fire out. No one died during that night, or in the other protests of varying violence and upheaval that occurred in the following days and nights. Now, I do hear some of you dear viewers asking, well, what made Stonewall turn into a riot if conditions were like this all across the US? And I couldn't tell you. An obvious answer would be that it was due to a second raid happening so shortly after the first. It could also be the poor conditions of the bar they partied in, or their very existence being illegal. Or perhaps it could just be a situation like the straw that broke the camel's back. You know, all the little tortures of everyday life, of homo and transphobia, of all the little indignities they suffered just due to being different. That all it took was a couple of people who had had enough to ignite the powder keg that exists within the soul of every oppressed person, waiting and eager to blow. and what an explosion it was. Now, just to make it clear here, lest someone accuses me of something or other, I don't advocate for violence. In fact, peaceful protesting should always be the first step to combating inequality. After that, escalation to civil disobedience is warranted. But if civil disobedience fails? Well, much like the explosion that was Stonewall, all that tension and anger will eventually find its way out somewhere and somehow. Although the civil rights movement and Stonewall were two differing escalations of protest, both were extremely effective at rousing people to act. But what did, the centrists think of these? Well, in regards to King's practices in particular, a Guardian article by Michael Harriot sums it up best. In 1966, Gallup measured his approval rating at 32% positive and 63% negative. That same year, a December Harris poll found that 50% of whites felt King was hurting the Negro cause of civil rights, while only 36% felt he was helping. By the time he died in 1968, 3 out of 4 white Americans disapproved of him. In the wake of his assassination, 31% of the country felt that he had brought it on himself. Regarding Stonewall, the mainstream media at the time didn't report it. Well, at least not any of the TV stations. The papers did report on the riots, but they twisted it in 2 key ways. The first was that they only took testimonies from police. You know, the institution that has historically never ever lied about or abused its power against oppressed groups in any way whatsoever and can clearly be trusted to deliver an unbiased accounting of the facts. The second was that they didn't actually report it as a gay protest or riot. Instead, as Mr. Painter wrote,
The 3 city dailies, the New York Times, the New York Daily News, and the New York Post wrote a smattering of stories in which they quoted exclusively police sources and offered little context. The story was framed as an instance of lawless youth run amok, an almost unprovoked riot.
Of course, independent media sources wrote about what actually happened while taking interviews of the protesters. But boy oh boy, I'm so glad we live in a time where the media doesn't leave out, change, or distort the facts. Or even simply lie. Oh fuck. But it wasn't just the media that tried to keep the Stonewall riots hushed. The Mattachine Society, a once-strong gay rights group led by actual communists in its inception, until it was slowly taken over by reformist liberals, also responded to the riots, by basically writing the equivalent of "Gays Be Quiet" and graffiti on the Stonewall. Clearly, if centrists had their way, these movements would never have happened, and numerous gains in civil rights for many oppressed groups wouldn't be as far along as they are now. But before continuing to explore one of the most important phrases in this video, the idea that civil rights are only far along instead of being at their peak and everyone having full equality, I want to focus on what made these movements so effective and why centrists fought so hard against and disliked them. To do this, I'd like to focus primarily on Letter from Birmingham Jail, written by King. I'd say everyone in the US should have read it, but let's be honest, our education system is shit, especially when it comes to civil rights in certain more conservative states. Anyways, in the letter, King makes several correct observations. The first being that the moderates who told him his methods are wrong and that he needs to wait aren't actually bad people. He then spends the rest of the time lambasting this idea of centrism because he viciously points out that it's easy to wait and have no protests when you're not the one suffering extreme prejudice and abuse. He wants peaceful negotiations with those in power, without the need for protest, but those negotiations don't come out of the voluntary goodness of the oppressors' hearts. At numerous points throughout the letter, King makes reference to the fact that time is simply a tool, one that moderates don't want to use while fully letting the oppressors use it destructively. That's why the tactic King settles on is
nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored.
This is the key reason why centrists feared him, because by not remaining quiet, by being open about injustice, people, and most importantly centrists, will be more likely to act, more likely to cause change. King actually cited the moderates for praising how police handled the situation, because optically the police tried to handle it well and non-violently in public, but in reality were extremely harsh and cruel. And King points out centrists would be compelled to cry out against them once they knew of the injustices that the police inflicted. Remember earlier all the way back to Inquisitor Fawkes? Centrists are fine with violence so long as it doesn't harm them physically or emotionally. You've probably seen the photos and videos I'm showing you on the news or in school of the vicious abuse that was set upon civil rights protesters in the South. This evidence was one of the most powerful tools of the movement. Physical proof of abuse that, when shared across the nation, motivated people to act. It's also why, after the Vietnam War, the military was much more restrictive of journalists who went into war zones. It was an attempt to hide the atrocities committed by them. But that's a video for another day. Regardless, the most profound statement King made in the letter is a lesson none of us should ever forget.
I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you and the goals you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set a timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection.
As crazy as it seems, centrists are one of our greatest enemies. They implicitly support the oppressors and always attempt to squash any attempts at change and reform. They allow the oppressors to be in positions of power and abuse minorities longer than if it was just the oppressed and the oppressors. And yet, although they can make a terrifying foe, King understood that once they were shown the hidden underbelly of the world, they would take action and side with the oppressed. That's the lesson I want us to take. Knowledge is power. Ignorance is death. Awareness is the greatest ally of any progressive movement, even if that awareness isn't wanted, especially when it isn't wanted. When centrists tell us no or that's not true, tell them again. If they cover their ears and hum a tune, whip out a megaphone and make them go deaf. If, like with Socrates, they threaten us with bodily harm or death, say it one more time as you smile before the gallows. And now, I want to go back to the statement I made, that while civil rights are far along, they aren't perfect, because injustice is still here, and centrists are still fighting to preserve it. Exhibit A. When people were peacefully protesting the Supreme Court's draft to undo Roe v. Wade outside the homes of the judges, there was a split among Democrats. While there were some who were for it so long as it remained peaceful, reformist, there were others like Senator Dick Durbin, a Democrat from Illinois who agreed with Republican lawmakers that protesting outside of someone's house was an implicit threat of violence, while also stating that these protesters are demeaning and adolescent and not convincing at all when you're trying to plead your case by doing something that outrageous. Gee willikers, Dick. I'm so sorry these protesters are making the judges feel demeaned. You know, those same judges that want to demean women and take away their right to bodily autonomy. But yeah, no, fuck women's rights when we have to worry about the judge's feelings over the consequences of their outrageous actions, right, Dick? Fucking asshat. But before going on and talking about all the depressing, distressing, and at times horrifying things being done against trans people in this country, I just want to say that you matter and are real. And no matter what, I care about you. If you need someone to talk to, reach out and I'll be happy to talk. While this is primarily meant for my trans viewers, I mean that for all my viewers. Alright, let's get into the messy stuff. While LGBTQ same-sex couples can marry, 27 states don't have any legal protections for their LGBTQ citizens. Hundreds of legislative efforts have been made against the community in 2022 alone.
Florida's parental rights and education bill, dubbed by critics as the Don't Say Gay bill, will officially go into effect tomorrow as schools around the state start to prepare for the new school year. And it's not just Florida, as similar legislation has gained steam across the country. So tonight, ABC's Rena Roy takes a look at the laws and how some LGBTQ advocates are pushing back.
As Pride Month comes to a close, outrage remains over what critics call Don't Say Gay bills, as more lawmakers support legislation around the country.
We're going to make sure that parents are able to send their kid to kindergarten without having some of this stuff injected into their school curriculum.
Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, perhaps the most famous of them, yet not even close to being the most disgusting or destructive.
This year, it's been torched in Texas.
Hell no. We're putting up more flags.
Burned down in Kentucky.
It could have easily caught a house on fire.
In Baltimore, police are investigating a possible hate crime after homes burned down across the street from where a pride flag was lit on fire.
In February, Texas Governor Greg Abbott ordered state agencies to report the parents of transgender kids who receive gender-affirming medical treatment or puberty blockers for child abuse. A direct consequence of this order is that transgender children are attempting to commit suicide. I was just made aware of what I'm about to discuss next the last day I was writing this script. Antonio Vo, a transgender boy, attempted to kill himself the day that Abbott issued the letter. He cited that letter, the political climate in general, and being misgendered at school as the reason why. And you know what happened next? The doctors told the family that they had to report them, and next month investigators came to their door, not because of the suicide attempt, but because the family was trying to support their trans son, and Abbott considered it child abuse. It's disgusting, it's vile, it's literally driving children to suicide for his own political gains. I'm sorry, it's just so evil. But at least this corresponds with the information gathered by the Trevor Project, a 2022 survey of LGBTQ people ages 13 to 24. There's a lot of important statistics, and I'll only be touching on a few, so I highly encourage you all to check it out, and I'll leave the link in the description. But as for the important factors, the first is that 45% of LGBTQ youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, and nearly 1 in 5 transgender and non-binary youth attempted suicide, and LGBTQ youth of color reported higher rates than their white peers. LGBTQ youth who live in a community that is accepting of LGBTQ people reported significantly lower rates of attempting suicide than those who did not. This should hopefully dispel the conservative myth that LGBTQ people try to kill themselves simply because they're mentally ill. The quotes, graphs, and example in Texas provided earlier show that social ostracization, abuse, and targeted laws against a certain group of people induce higher rates of suicide. But that's what the modern conservative party is. The metaphorical and literal death of LGBTQ people. I've already talked about the hundreds of legislative attempts made to diminish the life of the community, and that all of the implicit goals are to try and limit the amount of transgender people that exist. Even though the explicit language doesn't say round them up and put them into death camps, well, at least not their bills. This is Robert Foster, a demon in human skin, aka a former GOP state representative of Mississippi who tweeted that trans people and their supporters are groomers who need to be shot by firing squad. And no, the person who won against him, Tate Reeves, isn't that much better considering he signed into law a ban on trans athletes competing on the team of their gender. When questioned about his very disgusting tweet, Foster simply doubled down on it and then later tripled down, calling for direct political violence. In a response tweet, Foster claimed that now the godless have power and they're destroying our country. Soon we will have to deal with this directly. I don't know if he actually sounds like that, but it feels like he sounds like that. Then he also continued to talk about how firing squads are the most effective and painless method of mass killing, compared to, in his mind, the only other rational option of helicopters and pushing people into the Gulf of Mexico? Okay, yeah, sorry everyone. I was wrong. I got it wrong. He isn't just a demon in human skin, he's a cost-effective one. Still a piece of shit, though. Yes, this deranged man isn't writing laws that will put everyone left of right to the firing squad, but words alone are still power, and rhetoric like that can, has, and will incite violence against trans people everywhere. Now, while I'm loath to use this example, shortly after the mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas, current GOP rep Paul Gosar cited conspiracy theory in a tweet that claimed the shooter was a transsexual leftist illegal alien. Again, I don't know if he actually sounds like that, but it fits the bill. The day after that tweet, a transgender high schooler by the name of Tracy was grabbed by 4 men and forced to face them while they blamed people like her for Uvalde and said many dehumanizing things to her, in addition to the mainstream conservative narrative that trans people and their supporters are grooming children. Thankfully, Tracy wasn't physically harmed in a lasting way, but it's ample proof that words have the power to incite violence. And that violence is already here. In 2021, the Human Rights Campaign recorded the highest number of transgender fatalities in the US, ending up at 47. Remember everyone, tell centrists this, force them to listen, scream it if you have to, make them understand that this blood is on their hands, that the discrimination minorities everywhere face is also their fault. By doing so, you help bring us that much closer to impactful change, to making civil rights broader, to perhaps finally having everyone be equal. Now, I'm sure some of my viewers might be wondering why I didn't compare the modern Republican Party to fascists. They certainly are, and the comparison is apt. However, a topic like that is way too large for this video. People have written entire books on the subject, and regulating it to one paragraph in my video on the LGBTQ community and centrists isn't really doing it justice. I will, however, touch on it in more detail in my upcoming video, reclaiming the phrase pro-life. So be on the lookout for that one. So, the last point I want to talk about actually relates all the way back to Crowley's book. I just didn't really figure out a good way to add it in earlier, so I'm just going to do it now regardless of the flow of things. It's my video, I can do what I want. If you want proper narrative flow, go watch PBS or something, I don't care. Anyways, something interesting to note, and I don't know if Crowley intended this interpretation or not, is that in addition to being a ruthless centrist, Inquisitor Fawkes is also the perfect example of former minorities turned centrist. You see, Fawkes isn't actually straight. She spent the night with women and doesn't find the male body attractive. When I was doing research for this video and couldn't quite remember the page she confirmed her tastes on, Nate Crowley himself actually politely informed me that yes, Fawkes is gay. And yet she was able to take the side of the conservative space marine. Sadly, this is an all too accurate representation of real life politics and situations. Throughout history, when a group of people starts to become more accepted and a new minority group appears, instead of attempting to aid the new minority group, oftentimes some members of the formerly oppressed become some of the most zealous oppressors. A modern look at this would be TERFs, the group of feminists that are transphobic. They believe that trans women aren't real women and discriminate against them as they fight for women's rights, something that, while it has come a long way historically, still isn't 100% on the same level of the rights that men have. Again, this video isn't about feminism, so I'm not going to go into details about that here. But I do want to give an example, this one especially because of how concerning it is. This is Helen Joyce, a journalist and author of the transphobic book, Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality. She recently had an interview with Helen Stanlin and described her goal when it came to transgender people.
And in the meantime, while we're trying to get through to the decision makers, we have to try to limit the harm. And that means reducing or keeping down the number of people who transition. And that's for two reasons. One of them is that every one of those people is a person who's been damaged. But the second one is every one of those people is basically, you know, a huge problem to a sane world. Like if you've got people that, and whether they're transitioned, whether they're happily transitioned, whether they're unhappily transitioned, whether they're detransitioned, if you've got people who've dissociated from their sex in some way, every one of those people is someone who needs special accommodation in a sane world where we re-acknowledge the truth of sex. And I mean, the people who've been damaged by it, the children who've been put through this, those people deserve every accommodation we can possibly make. But every one of them is a difficulty.
Yes.
You know? And I mean, I know that sounds heartless. I'm trying to say exactly the opposite of sounding heartless. I'm saying every one of those people for 50, 60, 70 years is going to need things that the rest of us just don't need because the rest of us are just our sex. So the fewer of those people there are, the better in the sane world that I hope we will reach.
So that's the hill you're gonna die on, huh, Helen? To limit the amount of transgender people that exist in your sane world? That transgender people are insane with troubles that don't actually exist? That they're a burden on society? Do you know who else made a similar argument, Helen? The fucking Nazis did about the mentally ill and disabled before trying to kill all of them off too. Congratulations, Helen. You're look, I don't really have an insult here. You're on the same intellectual level as the fascists that committed mass genocide. Like, what the fuck are you doing? Hey everyone, I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you. This video kind of spiraled out of control when I was making it. The script got over twice as long as the ones I normally go with, and half the time it felt like I was just a babbling, incoherent mess, vaguely stringing points together like the stringboard meme. I also really want to thank Solmatol, who took time out of her day to review my ramblings and give me some great feedback. But yeah, I wanted to go all out with this video, so I hired a bunch of VAs, an artist, and I even had an editor, and really, I couldn't have done this all without you. I mean that. Even if you rarely comment and you just watch my videos, I want to say thanks. Without this support, I wouldn't have gotten here, and I really hope that my content just keeps improving for everyone. If you want to keep somewhat up to date on my projects, I have a link to a Google Doc that shows you all the video ideas I have and the progress I've made on them. I'll leave a link to that in the description too. If you want to support this channel even more, I do have a Patreon with numerous tiers and rewards like having your name at the end of my videos. But yeah, that about wraps it up. See all you gals, gents, and peeps next time.